Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our 2026 Trends in College Admissions webinar, aka what we learned from the last admissions cycle. Before we get to the presentation slides, I want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Jay. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Director of College Advising here at First Choice Prep. I am actually at one of our offices at Melbourne currently. I am one of our elite tutors as well. And today I am joined by one of our other fantastic college consultants, Caroline, who is also one of our very select few elite test prep tutors. We'll go back and forth just throughout throughout the presentation. If you have any questions about anything that we discussed today, please feel free to type it into our Q&A chat, and we will not address them until the very end, but I promise that we will address every single one of your questions. So, what we are going to cover today, we're going to begin one by talking about some of the trends in the application cycle that we noticed from this past year. And then moving on to talking about the most important factors that we should be considering as we generate our college list and prepare to write our applications. This is going to be especially important if you guys are currently juniors or if you guys are parents of juniors. And then we'll talk about some of the, I guess, non-class related factors that affect the application, such as essays, values, and extracurriculars. Moving on to, of course, our most popular discussion, standardized exams, APs, SAT, and ACT. We'll finish off by talking about the ideal timeline for applying to colleges, and then what you guys can be doing next. So to kick us off, let's take a look at a little bit at the 2026 numbers in college admissions. So this past year, we saw 1.5 million applicants around the world submitting over 10 plus million applications. This is an increase of over 8% compared to the 2024 applications. And our FCP students, those seniors who worked with us this past year, averaged about 17 applications per person. Now, this number can seem a little bit high and surprising to many of you guys, but it actually goes to show just how competitive this process has become and is continuing to become. Right. When I first started off in this industry, 11 years ago, I would say that students on average apply to about 10 to 12 schools. This is definitely no longer the case. These days, students are on average applying to more schools, mainly because of the uncertainties surrounding the application process, the lack of transparency when it comes to the application process, and of course, as I mentioned briefly before, the sheer competitive nature of the application process. On the test prep side of things, we saw an 11% rise in test score submissions nationally. We are finding that even for schools that are test optional, and we're going to get into this a little bit more later, a lot of students are starting to submit test scores, and we are finding that more and more colleges are now starting to require tests again post-COVID. I know it's been a while at this point, but the University of Florida schools, right, Florida state schools are now all mandating test score submissions, and a lot of popular schools like Ohio State, for example, which is very popular among our Livingston Melbourne students. That is also another example of a school that is requiring test score submissions. We are also seeing a major rise in applicants to Southern schools, especially for those who are trying to study something like business or engineering. I think business specifically, we saw an over 30% rise in the number of applicants countrywide, which is a record number. Now, obviously, there are some, attractions to applying to Southern schools. Generally speaking, compared to Northeast schools, it does tend to be a little bit cheaper in terms of their tuition. The cost of living also tends to be generally a little bit cheaper, and of course, it is warmer as well, right? So, we are finding that Southern schools are becoming more popular. Now let's talk a little bit about some of the other trends that we noticed. One thing that we have noticed and we have seen a lot of parents ask about before is how legacy affects admissions process. And in the past, if your parents or maybe grandparents went to a particular undergraduate institution, there was a little bit of an advantage that was given to students. However, this is becoming less apparent. And some colleges, like let's say, for example, University of Michigan, right? They are explicitly letting applicants know that even if you do have the so-called legacy, it's not necessarily going to really give you an advantage in your particular application process or review. Now, just because the number of, applicants are increasing, right, which therefore means that selectivity is dropping, it doesn't necessarily translate that applicant quality is increasing. Now, this is a really important thing I want to emphasize because when we are applying to colleges, obviously we want to be admitted and we want to be admitted to as many schools as possible. But, more often than not, students who are well qualified and even schools that you may consider to be target or even safety schools sometimes, they reject students, and you may be surprised and you may feel demoralized by it, right? But when or if that ever happens to you, I want you to know that selectivity is the reason why you were not admitted. A lot of times it just boils down to luck, right? You may be well qualified, but because of the sheer number of applicants and the size of the school doesn't really change from year to year, right? So it's just, it goes to say, I guess, in a nutshell, that um, being admitted to a particular school a lot of times comes down to factors beyond your control. To just kind of give you like a quick example, USC, University of Southern California, this past year saw a record number of applicants. There were over 56,000 applicants to the school, and they only admitted about 4,000 or so students, right? So when we think about the acceptance rate at that point, right, it's actually comparable to a lot of like Ivy League schools. And when we think about institutions like U of Florida, U of Maryland, which are both schools very popular among our students, we can see something very similar, right? Now, what this also means is that ED, meaning early decision, is becoming the default path for a lot of students. Many schools are admitting about 50 to 60% of their incoming class through the early decision, which is binding. Now, primarily, one of the reasons why colleges are doing this is because schools care a lot about the yield of their school, right? So what that means is if a particular school admits 100 students, right? How many of those 100 students actually end up enrolling in the school? Right. Now, early decision, because it is binding, right, guarantees that yield from those students, right? So more and more schools are accepting a higher percentage of their incoming class through the early decision process. So if there is a school that you absolutely love, it is your dream college, I would highly encourage you to take advantage of this option if that school does offer early decision. By the way, not all schools do. Many state universities, especially, they don't offer early decision. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize is that just because we say 50 to 60% of the incoming class is admitted, it doesn't necessarily translate that your chances of admittance is 50 to 60%, right? So if, let's say, going back to, let's say, the USC example, right? They admit about, let's just say like 2,000 students through early decision. You can imagine that the number of applicants who apply to USC early decision is probably closer in the range of like 10,000, right? Another thing that we are noticing is that more and more schools are limiting internal transfer. Now, what this means is in the past, one of the quote unquote strategies that some parents and students used is applying to a less popular major at a particular school and then looking to switch majors once you actually go to the school. Now, obviously, universities are becoming aware that students are doing this. So when we, for example, think about Purdue, right? And undoubtedly, the most popular major at Purdue is computer science. But if you decide, oh, computer science at Purdue is just so incredibly difficult to be admitted to, why don't I apply to data science major, right? Well, if you are admitted as a data science major to Purdue, it is incredibly difficult to switch to becoming a computer science major once you're there. Same goes for, let's say, UIUC, right? University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. They explicitly make it nearly impossible for you to switch your major. So I do want to encourage you guys to look into those policies for each of the schools you're planning on applying to just make sure that if this is something that you're considering doing, that the school allows you to. Now, lastly, I want to say that because, students are applying with all really strong numbers and really strong test scores, essays are carrying more weight, and we really believe that it may be a key differentiator between someone who is admitted versus someone who may be deferred, waitlisted, or rejected, right? So if you are a current junior, I would highly encourage you guys to begin thinking about what you want to write about on your, Common App personal statement, or coalition application if you're using that, or other applications depending on the school you're going to be applying to. And Caroline will talk us through that a little bit more in detail in just a second. So, what's the magic number of applications we should be sending out to? We said, around 17 is the average, at least for our FCP students, right? Now, typically, we like to split this into three categories, reach, target, and safety schools. Now, some students, some families like to even create a fourth category to say far reach schools, but usually we like to separate it into three. Now, safety schools are schools where your scores are well above the median and a school that is, that makes sense for you in terms of cost, right? A lot of times, the safety schools that you choose will have fantastic honors colleges that will come with, let's say merit-based scholarships, which can also aid in your annual cost. And in the past, we used to say maybe one to two schools for safety. These days, again, because of the selectivity, we are encouraging closer to three to five. Now, target schools, I think a lot of students don't understand what target school means. Target schools are schools not where your scores are in the median, but your scores are higher than the median. Okay. And this should make up the bulk of your college list, roughly about 7 to 8 schools. And then reach schools are schools where your scores are right around the median, hopefully a little bit higher as well. And typically these will be, we would assume that the acceptance rate to these schools are a little bit lower than some of your target schools, right? And the reason why we say that your scores need to be generally in the higher range is because if you think about, let's say your dream school is to apply to Brown, right? You can imagine that everyone who applies to Brown applies because they believe that they have a shot of getting into Brown, right? Which means that they probably will have a really strong GPA and a really fantastic test score as well, right? Yet we all know that somewhere like Brown, an Ivy League institution, is incredibly difficult to be admitted to, regardless of what your scores are, right? So I think that can provide a little bit of a perspective on why, your scores need to be above the median, generally speaking. Now, last thing I do really want to say regarding the number of applications is that it is really, really important that you love every school on your list. Okay. And this is including your safety schools, right? This process is really, really challenging. It's really tough. And even if you put in the best effort, sometimes luck doesn't go your way. right? So even your safety schools should be schools where you would be thrilled to attend in case the other schools don't work out.
So Jay is talking about this average number of applications, these 17 schools to apply to. But we also want to be thinking about how we make that list because building a strategic college list is incredibly important. And we typically break this down into about seven things. But the biggest thing you really should be thinking about is that college is going to be either your home or your student's home for the next 4 years. And so it's really important to consider all of the things that are going to affect that life as a young adult. So when we consider the factors that go into selecting a college, we typically break them into these seven things you see here. So, size and location are exactly what they sound like. Some students very much prefer a smaller, maybe more liberal arts sort of education where we're looking at 3 to 5,000 undergrad students. Maybe you want to go to a really large research institution, and so you're looking at more of 20,000 undergrad students. We also are more and more seeing students be interested in going to college abroad. In many other countries, the application process is a bit simpler and rather more transparent than what we have in the US. And tuition is definitely more affordable relative to what we experience here in the States. So that's always a factor. You also want to be thinking about the acceptance rate. Bear in mind, try not to trust totally what the acceptance rate is that comes up on Google because that number can vary widely depending on your particular major. It also can be inflated by specialized students who are being accepted for athletics or merit or any other particular reason. So when you're thinking about your target and your safety schools versus the acceptance rates for your reach schools, your target and your safety school should have a relatively higher acceptance rate than your reach schools because it's just the nature of the business. Think about like NYU. We talk about how numbers can vary depending on your major. NYU Business School, if you're familiar with Stern, has a considerably lower acceptance rate than their arts and sciences school. Indiana, that pretty much any other major aside from their business school, the admissions rate is significantly higher. So, always a component. We also want to think about your academic opportunities. Now, yes, your classes, but major broadly, also your research opportunities, support for essay writing and academic advising that might be available, office hours with your professors, the number of libraries that are on campus, all elements that go into it. We also are wanting to think about your extracurriculars. Talk a little bit more about extracurriculars and how they factor into your application in a moment, but the extracurriculars you're going to want to experience on campus are probably an extension of things you're already doing at a high school level. And these are generally things that you care about a great deal. So, are those kinds of activities available at the schools that you're looking at, whether it be community service or athletics or academic clubs, honors schools, anything to that effect? And beyond that, we're also thinking about student life. Some students really prioritize being able to work while they're at college. So we call this work study. And some schools offer a variety of on campus jobs, but some are prioritized to certain types of students. Some are available to anyone. So a component to think about is there Greek life? And especially where do students tend to hang out, whether on campus or off? A lot of our metropolitan schools, again, schools like Boston, NYU, a lot of that out of class hangout time happens off campus. Whereas you might be looking at other schools where it's very much more on campus hangout vibes, more like a Dartmouth kind of situation. So we also are thinking about your future career path. Now, yes, you're going to college to learn, but you also should be thinking about what comes after your undergrad. Are you planning to transition to grad school? Is there pre-law or pre-med advising that you're looking for? Is there a career center? Is there any sort of pipeline to a particular career path or a particular post-education opportunity? And of course, affordability is always going to be a component. Do you need financial aid? Are you looking for merit based scholarships? Are you hoping to apply to an honors college where there will be financial aid opportunities? And we're also thinking about if you live on campus, what are your expected total costs? And on the flip side of that, if you live off campus, what should you expect? What we're seeing for numbers over the last year or so is that living expenses tend to be about a third of your annual tuition for every year of school. So, always a component to think about. Now, these are the things that you should be thinking about when building your college list. But remember that as you are picking your colleges, the colleges are also picking you. And we always want to be thinking about what they are highlighting when they're picking their students. So generally, these are broken up into three domains. So, of course, colleges want students who are going to be a good fit for their school, for their environment, what they prioritize with students both academically and socially. We also are wanting to see confidence in your path, whatever your major might be, or if it's something perhaps outside of that particular sphere, but it's still something you care very much about. And schools very much want active and involved students. They don't want just students who participate in the classroom, they want students who are going to contribute positively to the campus community. So, really, what we're talking about here for what colleges are looking at is six specific things. And they're all things that you probably would have come to mind, but the most important are your GPA and your transcript and your test scores together. Now, whether you take SAT or ACT, it doesn't matter, but what schools will do, and especially in the case of many selective schools, although not all of them, is they will take your GPA and they will take your SAT or your ACT scores and use those numbers to create what's called an academic index. Schools operate on a scale of either 160 to 240 or a scale of 1 to 9. It can vary depending on your institution. Now, these are essentially arbitrary numbers and they don't necessarily share where these numbers come from, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're operating on the 160 to 240 scale, we're thinking 240 is the best, or if the 1 to 9 scale, 9 is the best. But what 240 and 9 mean in those contexts are that you have a perfect GPA, a perfect test score, and that it couldn't possibly be any better. Always something that is going to be something that they're looking at, but your goal ultimately, if you're trying to aim for a school that does use academic index in their considerations, we're aiming for a 7 to 9 sort of range. And what's great is there are sites online where you can go to the website, throw in your GPA, throw in your SAT or your ACT score, and say, based on this school, what would my academic index be? Now, yes, academic indexes are used at many selective institutions, but more than anything, your GPA and your test scores are the most important numbers that schools are going to see when they look at your application. It is therefore extremely important to challenge yourself academically while still achieving those high scores and making sure that you're putting plenty of effort into your SAT or your ACT prep to get entrance into schools looking at what really matters in your application. This is what Jay was talking about before with saying your essays. Your essays are where colleges learn who you are beyond the numbers. And we really do believe and are seeing evidence of the fact that these essays are a massive deciding factor in your acceptance. We've seen students whose numbers are rather below the median of a school that they might be applying to, but they've also told a really compelling story in their essays, and that has pushed them over the line. You also ought to be thinking about recommendation letters. Now, recommendation letters are coming from your junior year teachers. So you should have one from a STEM subject and one from a humanities or a social sciences class. Now, ideally, these are classes where you are presenting yourself in the best way possible so that these recommendation letters are going to be aligning with what you want the teachers to be saying about you. And you should be making sure that your letters align with who you are presenting yourself to be in your applications. If you are presenting yourself to be an extremely studious and very introverted person in your essays and in your applications, ideally your teachers aren't going to be writing recommendation letters of, wonderful student, is very chatty and very outgoing in class. Not bad things to be, but making sure that you're aligned with how you're presenting yourself. Some schools do allow for an optional third recommendation letter. This should then be someone who is outside your academic world, ideally, someone who can then speak to who you are outside the classroom, someone who speaks to another side of who you are. If you're doing research with a professor or you have a mentor in a field, an academic advisor of a club that you've been involved in for a long time, a director of a camp you've been a part of, things of that nature, people like that. Remember that if you're a junior now, you should be starting to have those conversations informally with the teachers you're considering. A lot of teachers tend to have a cap on the number of recommendation letters that they write. And if you wait until the last possible moment to ask, you're going to have to figure out something else. And that's not going to be fun for you. Now, schools are also going to be looking at your extracurricular activities. Your extracurricular activities means literally anything and everything you've done outside the classroom, whether it's research, whether it's a job, whether it's honor societies, clubs, anything that is outside the classroom. All good things to keep in mind. And the last thing that we're going to be really thinking about is the idea of demonstrated interest. And this is something I'll dig more into in a moment. Now, we said test scores and academics are important, but your essay is your cornerstone of your application. Every application platform, whether it's Common App, whether it's Coalition, it doesn't matter, will have a personal statement. And this is what goes out to all of the schools you are applying to, goes out with all of those applications. Now, this essay should be about you. It should not be school specific because all of the schools are seeing it. What schools do have where you can be more school specific is supplemental essays. Most schools have at least one or two. We've seen schools with as many as 10, and they can be really specific in target. It can be something as straightforward as specifically, why did you choose the major you did and why at this particular school, or what other academic interests do you have? They also can sometimes skew a little bit more creative or a little bit more abstract. If you could teach a class about anything, what would it be? Or what was your favorite thing about last Monday? All of these supplemental essays are going to be very targeted, and they're going to range from 50 to another 650 words. And so it's really important to be your authentic self. To that point, do not use AI. Admissions offices are using AI checkers. There are also certain word patterns that we find come up when students are using AI to write pieces, certain sentence structures or grammatical punctuations that are indicative of AI usage. Ultimately, your essays are the point to humanize yourself, to show who you are beyond the numbers. And so your goal there is to share who you are and why you are a well-qualified applicant. AI is not going to do that for you. Now, I will say that essays tend to be the most time-consuming part of the process. My first choice prep students, and I'm sure Jay will say the same, tend to go through as many as 6 to 8 drafts per piece. So you should be planning for this element of your applications to take a substantial amount of time and effort, something that you want to get going sooner rather than later. We will also thinking about extracurricular activities. We've talked about this some already, but especially as you reach those later years of high school, that's the time to prioritize. What colleges are looking for is depth, not quantity of extracurriculars. So if you're in 9th or 10th grade, exploration is wonderful. You should absolutely be experiencing as many different things as you can and seeing what really resonates with you. But by 11th grade, it's ideal that you only have a few extracurriculars that you're really into versus having a wide swath of extracurriculars where you're only doing more of that passive surface level investment. Also be thinking about, as you specialize in those extracurriculars that are related to your interests, especially in terms of major. If you are thinking about going into business, FBLA is a great opportunity. DECA is a great opportunity. If you're thinking more poli-sci or international relations, Model UN is a fantastic centerpiece there. Now, when you are filling out your applications, you will likely be using Common App, and Common App allows up to 10 entries, but there are ways to include more if there are items that are really important to you. Things to be conscious of are generic nonprofits. Unless it's nonprofit that is very specific to an interest that you have and you are making some sort of demonstrable progress in it, whatever your initiative might be, schools kind of cringe at those. Um, Also, summer programs are a great way to allow yourself to have a productive summer, but be careful the ones that you choose. There are so many summer programs out there, and picking the best ones are really important. There are programs that charge exorbitant tuition and they aren't really actually giving you anything of substance. A lot of the best summer programs are actually free. MIT has their MITES program as an engineering summer program. We also have Clark Scholars. So just be cognizant of the pedigree of your programs and what sort of focus it's putting into your interests. When you are plugging your extracurriculars into your application too, be doing it in order of importance. Now, when we say order of importance, this boils down to three things. Number one is how long you've been involved in that particular extracurricular. Also, be thinking about your specific role within it. Ideally, you're demonstrating some sort of leadership role within the organization and be considering the level of recognition of that extracurricular. Some of the ones I mentioned earlier, DECA, Model UN, those programs are extremely well known, and be thinking about if a program is national or international versus if it's something that is more specific to your particular school. Now, we also said about demonstrated interest. Demonstrated interest can look like a lot of different things. It can look like attending college fairs and staying in contact with your regional representatives. It can look like applying early decision, as Jay was talking about. But what the schools are really looking for is that you are demonstrating that you're interested in the school beyond just it being a good school, that you have done the research to see the opportunities that that specific school offers. Some schools count it, some schools don't. It is generally the last thing schools consider, but it is something to keep in mind. Now, one of the big things that we all are aware of is the concept of standardized tests. We do tend to find that test scores tend to be the third most important aspect of your profile, especially if you're applying to a larger school. Smaller, more liberal arts type schools focus less on that number necessarily because they're able to prioritize your essays a bit more. We'll talk a little bit about testing policies in a moment, but as Jay was saying, we've seen an 11% increase in the number of students submitting their test scores to school. So even if a school says that it's optional, having a really strong test score, especially for a larger institution, can be a boon to your application. Now, one thing we really try to emphasize with our students is focusing on what we can control in the application process versus what we can't. You may have all the perfect numbers and still be rejected for reasons that you can't affect. That is to say, college acceptance is kind of unfair at times. Two students with identical numbers can have very different results. And this is part of why we apply to a number of different schools where you'd be happy. You want to focus on presenting yourself the best that you possibly can and focus less on the result that you can't control. Now, when we say focusing on what we can when we say focusing on what we can control, it's all the things I was just talking about. Grades, absolutely your number one factor. Course rigor, whether it's honors or AP classes, if that's something manageable for you. Course selection and courses that are relevant to a potential major. Your standardized testing, SAT, ACT, and AP. Your extracurricular activities, again, focusing on that depth, not the quantity of activities. Your essays and building that really strategic college list. These are all things that you can actually control. Things that we can't control so much. Institutional priorities. A lot of schools have certain types of students that they look for. They also, in a lot of cases, will try to balance the number of males and females in a particular major or in a particular school. Also thinking about the major to which you might be applying, as Jay was saying earlier. If you're applying to something like comp sci at MIT, that's going to be an extremely difficult lift to get into. So things to be thinking about. Schools also have what we term a geographic quota. schools really value diversity and they try to balance where students are coming from. But you will find that schools on the West Coast, for example, generally prioritize accepting students from the West Coast, whereas our New Jersey students will probably have an easier time applying to New Jersey schools because they are from New Jersey. Uh, Jay addressed that legacy and donor influence. Now, like we said, it is something that schools are letting it be known that they are caring much less about. And so there's really no point worrying about that anyway. Application volume. As Jay said, we are seeing such a massive increase in the number of applications submitted to any given school. You can't control that. And you may be very well qualified for a school and you still don't get in. And that's just not your fault. And something we have to acknowledge that does exist is the idea of your high school's relationship with a particular school. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the idea of some of your schools doing better with applications to some institutions as opposed to others. Livingston, for example, does fantastically well with Tulane. Milburn does really well with schools like Wisconsin Madison. So even if it's a school where your high school doesn't necessarily have the most fantastic history with the school, that doesn't mean you shouldn't apply. What this means is that it's ultimately your application, your decision, and you should prioritize the schools that you want. It's just important to keep in mind that there are so many factors that are going to be outside of your control.
Wow, Caroline, thank you for all of that information. That was a lot.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about testing policies at different schools. I know it can be a little bit tricky, and I do want to just kind of preface that the testing policy really does differ by each university, and for some places, it is very different depending on the specific college within that same university. So if you are starting to form your college list, definitely check each school's testing policy. And if you are curious or confused about it, definitely also reach out to us and we are happy to clarify. So tests required, I mean, this is pretty simple, right? It means that students must submit an SAT or ACT score. Some schools that require testing now, I mentioned before, Florida public schools now do require them. Georgetown is a school that requires them. Cornell, Stanford, a lot of schools around the country are reinstating this testing policy. Now, test optimal. This is a not an official term. It is a term that we sort of coined in-house, but it basically means that officially these schools are test optional. But when we look at the statistics of admitted students, and by the way, you can find statistics of what happened with each school's admissions this past year through what we call the common data set. It is a public information that is available. You can search on Google and literally just type in common data set 2025 school name, right? And it'll be like the first link that comes up. And it gives you a comprehensive data on the numbers, right? The geographic quota that Caroline mentioned before, the number of applicants, the number of male applicants versus female applicants, what percentage of students submitted test scores, what percentage of students with submitted test scores were actually admitted, right? And so when we are talking about these test optimal schools, these are schools that, again, officially they are test optional, but you will definitely have a more of a competitive edge if you do submit a strong test score. These include schools like NYU, Chicago, Tufts, and other schools we have listed here. Test optional now. A lot of schools are still test optional, although it's becoming a little bit less so. This literally just means that if you have an SAT or ACT score that you want to show, go for it. If you don't, it is completely fine, right? A lot of liberal arts schools, including a school like Bowdoin, a fantastic liberal arts college in Maine, is completely test optional. GW, George Washington University in DC, Villanova, Clemson, Rutgers, these are all very popular schools among our students at least, and they are truly test optional. And then lastly, we have test the blind, which means that even if you have a fantastic SAT and ACT score, um, the schools will literally not accept that. And namely the University of California schools for several years now has been completely test blind. Now, um, whoops. Okay. Scores matter at competitive schools, right? As I mentioned earlier, right? In order for you to sort of distinguish yourself from other students with perhaps similar GPA and course rigor, a good test score is almost always a good way to just say, hey, like, this is how I compare myself, even compared to all the students around the country, right? And also, as you guys probably know at this point, that grade inflation is something that many colleges are very much aware of, right? So, it's SAT and ACTs are standardized, right? And so it's not something that is varies from school to school, right? So it's a consistent measurement of your academic potential. Um, Now, let's talk a little bit about SAT versus ACT and whether colleges have a preference. Now, the short answer is that there is no preference, and that if you have an amazing SAT score, you should not, spend time studying for the ACT. I would advise that you should channel that time, energy, and effort into adding more depth to your extracurriculars, studying more in school so that you raise your GPA, and same with if you have a good ACT score already. No school in the US has a preference for one over the other. Really, deciding between the SAT and the ACT is a matter of preference, and it's a stylistic difference, right? By design, the SAT has certain things that are advantageous for certain types of learners, and the ACT is different for those same reasons, right? Now, if you are unsure whether to take the SAT or the ACT, definitely take a diagnostic test with us. You can easily sign up for it on our website. We do host them in person if you are nearby one of our offices. We host one every other Sunday, and you also do have the option to sign up for one where you can take it at home as well. Once you take this diagnostic test, we're going to produce a score analysis and provide our recommendation as to which exam we believe is the best fit, and then we can come up with the test prep plan from there. Now, in terms of super scoring, right? Keep in mind that not all schools super score, okay? And what's really even weirder is that some schools super score the SAT, but not the ACT, and like vice versa. We still don't know why that is, but like Harvard, for example, explicitly states on their website that they super score the SAT, but not the ACT. So if you have taken one of these tests multiple times, check the super scoring policy as well. Some schools will literally just state that you need to submit all of your scores, like Georgetown, for example, and they do not necessarily super score. Um, let's talk a little bit more about the ACT because, as you guys know, it recently went through a change. It is now called sort of the enhanced ACT. It's a term that they decided on, not us. The older version is now called Legacy. ACT. And now, because the change happened relatively recently, I imagine that some of you guys probably took the older version as well as the newer version. And officially, you are able to mix match the older version with the newer version to come up with your highest composite super score if you did take both versions. Okay. Now in the new version, the composite score is only based on your English, math, and reading sections. The science section, if you decide to take it, is scored separately. Officially, it is optional. Okay. Now, if you are a student who is planning on pursuing a major in one of the STEM fields, I do still encourage you to submit a strong science score. I think it can definitely elevate your application. Now, there are many schools that are starting to come out, and we can imagine for, especially if we have sophomore parents here, we can imagine that probably the following year cycle, more and more schools will start to say, hey, we won't look at the science section at all. Similar to the way that, pretty much no school looks at the essay portion of the SAT and ACT anymore. These schools are like Georgia Tech, Virginia Tech, U of Georgia. Now, again, just as with all other things, there are also some schools that still recommend it. Schools like Georgetown, BU, Caltech, Duke, Johns Hopkins, Carnegie Mellon still do say on their website that you should submit a science section score if you are submitting the ACT. Now, if you did take the enhanced ACT with the science, and let's say you got a fantastic English, math, and reading score, and you bombed the science section, right? Knock on wood. But let's say that happened. In your application, for most schools these days, it is a self-reporting basis. What that means is that if you wish not to report something, you don't have to, right? Again, it's a little bit college dependent, but for the most part, it is okay to still opt in for the science. And ultimately, if you don't want to show colleges, you don't have to. So at least from my perspective, I don't think there's really much downside. Now, to talk about the testing timeline, especially if you guys are juniors right now, if you haven't already begun test prep, I highly encourage you to do so. Right now is a great time to start doing it with the goal of taking like the late summer, early fall testing dates. As I had briefly mentioned before, start with the diagnostic test. You can take it with us, you can take it somewhere else. I mean, there's, other companies that also offer it if you want to look for something else. But if you are a sophomore, I would say that, right now that the APs are over, once final exams are done, I would say right now is probably a good time for you to take it as well. Uh, Now, once you take the diagnostic test, we're going to create and execute a prep plan. Most students do study for the SAT and ACT for about, on average, 4 to 5 months, right? So if you begin, let's say, right after school ends around middle of June, we can probably get you ready by the October administrations. Thankfully, both the ACT and SAT has September as well as October administration. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize is that if you are a rising senior, so current juniors, the September ACT is going to be the last test that you are able to take in order to still be able to show those scores to early schools, so early decision or early action schools. For the SAT, you can still take the October test and still be in time. Now, for these, we're talking about like the November 1st deadlines, right? There are some schools like UNC traditionally, for example, they have an October 15th early action deadline, so that could be a little bit tricky for the SAT as well. For regular decision schools, the November and December administrations are also perfectly fine because generally speaking, deadline is January 1st, between January 1st and February 1st even.
So we're talking about junior timeline, but we also want to be thinking about what the application timeline looks like for seniors. Now, this is 100% your most important summer. Now, hopefully, you have things ready to go as far as doing something productive, whether it's an internship, a job, a summer program, whatever it happens to be. But also, hopefully, you're thinking about your college application. So the Common App opens on August 1st. That's typically what a lot of students use. But you can start working on your personal statement at least before then because the prompts don't generally change from year to year. Now, as Jay was saying, be thinking about your application deadlines in general. Early decision is generally November 1st. Like you said, there's a couple of those flukes in there that are more of an October 15th sort of timeline, but November 1st tends to be roughly when you're looking at. We also are going to have your early action deadlines, mid October to mid November, and your regular decision, January 1st, January 15th, or like you were saying, even as far into February. Uh, Thinking about any recommendation letters, starting to have those conversations, be meeting with your school counselors and making sure that you're securing those recommendations from the people that you're looking for our Livingston and Milburn students and students in a similar situation. Those are going to be submitted via Naviance. We have some students here from Columbia. Those are going to be more submitted via SCORE, but they are still going to be a component. And above all, be keeping your grades up. Early application schools and early decision schools will receive your first quarter, and your regular decision schools will get your whole first semester. So be keeping that in mind. Now, next steps for you. Where should we be going after this? Of course, maintaining your grades the best that you can, maintaining that high degree of rigor in so much as you possibly can. For our juniors, we should be researching colleges and making that preliminary list. Extra credit for anybody who wants to plan a trip to a nearby school to get a feel for what it actually looks like when you are on campus before they finish up school for the year. Might be a little bit tight right now, but as students come back in the fall, absolutely an opportunity. Also, be thinking about your SAT or your ACT scores. Those scores are hugely important. And let's make sure you're finishing your AP strong. We know that there's a few more this week. I personally know I have a lot of students taking AP Lang tomorrow. So be making sure that you're getting some good rest and some good studying in for all of that. Be also participatory in your academics. Don't just sit in class and be there to sit through it and take notes. Get involved, raise your hand, talk with your teachers, go to opportunity periods to build those relationships so that when it comes time to ask them for recommendation letters, they know who you are. We're also talking again about getting involved in those extracurricular activities and doing something meaningful, that it is deeper than just showing up to meetings. And my juniors, start brainstorming your personal statement. Be thinking about significant events that have happened to you or something that has been impactful in some way. Now, if you still have questions, especially questions that are, I know that we have some coming up in that Q&A chat, but if you have questions that are specific to your situation, feel free to schedule a free consultation with us. You can do that right on our website, have about an hour, and it's free to talk with Jay, to talk with me about your particular college prep journey. Also, be thinking about your SAT and your academic scores. So, if you need that diagnostic, if you need support in classes, get help earlier before it becomes a major issue down the line. We also have a college app webinar coming up on June 16th, Essays 101. And if you need the support or if you're wanting to get started with your SAT or your ACT prep, we've got some of those crash courses coming up in July, in August. And if you are one of our younger students where you haven't quite taken Algebra 2 yet, we also have an Algebra 2 prep course in August that will not only get you ready for the math side of your test prep, but it will also get you ready for those first few months of your academics so that when you see that Algebra 2 concept for the first time in September, you actually already have some comfort with it.
Great. I know that we are almost out of time and we are receiving a lot of questions. So I want to make sure that we get an opportunity to address everything, any questions that you guys may have. I know this was a lot of information. And so if you want any clarification on anything that we said, feel free to type it into the Q&A chat below, and we will begin addressing them just one by one in the order that they came in. Carolina and I will take turns depending on the specific question. The first question we see here is what websites are these that provide academic index? I will tell you that I believe academicindex.ai. I know
Mm-hmm.
it's a lame website, but
But it's easy to remember.
it's easy to remember. Yeah, you can go to that to calculate it. Also, if you type into Google academic index score for college application, you will see like five websites, and the first five websites they will all allow you to calculate a score, and some of them actually do allow you to pick which scale you want to use. I know Caroline mentioned like the 1 to 9 versus the 160 to 240. Um, yes, now hope that answered your question. And then second question, we have Given the AI impact on career, what are the most popular majors that students have chosen last year? I think this is a really great question. Caroline, I'll take this one.
Okay.
We definitely saw a major rise in applicants to business schools. I think across the country, we saw over like a 25% rise in the applicants to business schools. So even, when we think about actually pretty much every single school that has an undergraduate school of business, the acceptance rate has gone down tremendously. Now, on the flip side of things, we are seeing that, especially compared to, let's say, like 5 to 7 years ago, the number of applicants to computer science majors, I think, is definitely decreasing a little bit. At least with our students and students in the New Jersey area, I would say that the most popular are probably like pre-med majors like biology, chemistry, biochem, neuroscience. These tend to be very popular still. And we are again seeing a lot of students who want to major in finance, management, things like this. Finance, I think in particular, is definitely the most popular. I think partially it has to do with, social media kind of exposing students to like day trading and like opportunities for high schoolers to be able to do trading on their own and like get involved in virtual stock exchange and things like that, right? So, yeah, I guess there is sort of this appeal to it. Um, next question. Um, would you please explain more in detail what it means when you say super score? Caroline, do you want to explain this too?
Yeah, this is very much my wheelhouse. So, super score essentially means that a student can take the test, whichever one it is, multiple times and submit scores from multiple seatings of the test to support and demonstrate their best possible showing. So, let's say you are a student taking the ACT, and so you take it in April. You do very well on the English, you do very well on the reading. Math wasn't so strong, so you take it again, and then your math score is much better, but your English and reading may not have been as stellar. But you had strong scores from the first administration, so you can take your strong English, your strong reading, and your strong math, even though you took them over multiple months, and combine them together for your best possible composite score overall.
Great. Thank you so much. Keep in mind, again, not all schools super score. This really does depend on the specific college that you are applying to. I see that questions are continuously coming in, so please type in any of your questions that you guys may have. Another question says, what is rolling admission? I guess that is something that we did not really mention, but it's actually quite simple. I'll just quickly address it. It just means that some of the schools, like let's say U of Pittsburgh, for example, right? They have rolling admission, which essentially means first come, first serve, right? So they kind of dish out the your admissions decision as they come in. Okay. Not many schools have it though. Okay. But if a school does have it and you are a student that is, very well prepared and have your application ready early, um, the earlier you submit it, the more spots that are open, right? So I would imagine that the admissions are a little bit more lenient in the beginning because they have more spots. Um, another question says, early decision versus early action. Caroline, do you want to just quickly explain the difference between the two?
Sure. So, early decision is a binding contract that you sign. In almost all cases, you can only apply early decision to one school. And in a lot of cases, there are then stipulations about where you can apply early action based on where you apply early decision. Essentially, early decision means that if you get in there, that's where you're going. Early early admission is on the flip side is you can apply essentially to a sooner deadline, and it expresses that you have a high degree of interest in the school, but they also know that you're applying to other programs as well, and it can just give you a sooner result in terms of when you hear back about whether or not you've been admitted into the school.
Great. Yeah, I think one thing I do want to let parents also know is that A common misconception is that there is an advantage by applying early action to a school. But I will tell you that in most schools, that is actually not the case. And I guess the advantage is that you hear back earlier, but that really is pretty much it. And I will even add that for certain institutions, the early action admittance rate is actually lower than even regular decision admittance. So like Villanova, for example, their regular decision acceptance rate is, I want to say, more than double of the early action. Okay. Like Georgetown is another school. If you apply early action to Georgetown, you don't really have an advantage over applying regular decision. So it is a little bit dependent on each school. But again, the advantage is that you get to hear back earlier. Now, just the last thing I do want to address regarding that is some schools have what we call a restrictive early action. Actually, Georgetown happens to be one of these schools. Notre Dame is another school that is like that. Very famously, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford also have restrictive early action. The exact policy regarding restrictive early action can be a little bit different per school, but in short, for most restrictive early action, if you apply restrictive early action, they make it so that you cannot apply anywhere early decision. Okay, so for these schools, there is actually an advantage to applying because you are showing a considerable level of commitment. Um, I think we just about addressed all the questions, and which is great because we're right at around 8 p.m. We will give you about 10 seconds to maybe ask some any last minute questions. If not, okay. Thank you again, everyone, for spending an hour with us to talk about the transit college admissions. Um, as if you have any other questions, like we said, feel free to reach out to us to schedule a consultation. It's free. We'll spend about an hour talking with you guys about your individual situation because we know that every single student's application is different, right? And you can reach out to us via email if you have any quick questions that you want to ask. And hopefully we get to see each other soon. Okay. I think, yep. Okay. That is about it. Thank you guys, and we'll talk soon. Have a good evening.
Thanks. Bye.